your guide. Before we start, which Marco will do the introduction of our speaker today, if this is your first time, this is why we do it, right? We actually do believe that Christianity has something to offer to make our lives better, because we actually believe that the teaching of Jesus is meant to transform all of our lives, not just our spiritual lives or the times when we pray or go to church, but our work situations and relationships we have and our families and so forth. And so as a church, we strive to do it. We do it, with women ministry called Lydia. So we have, as you know, hundreds of women attend Lydia every year. About 1,400 last year joined us for Lydia stuff. And then we love to do this. So last year, 600 of us attended the Executive Series for Men. This is actually the biggest one. So this is great. Thanks for coming. And we do it because we do think that for us men, it's probably way harder to talk about spiritual things and find space when we actually can wrestle and acknowledge sometimes a disconnect between the spiritual and the workspace. And I've been blessed to be here for 12 years. I've been a pastor for 4. And something that I've learned early on is that pretty much everybody in the church is smarter than I am. And I only thought, well, if I could get those people to really not only to drink with each other, but also to talk with each other. Drinking is not a problem, right? But if I could get people talking with each other, your lives would be better off, right? You can network and you can support each other and you can be present to one another. And so I think we can do incredible things if we just spend more time with each other. And time, of course, is hard. So we only do it twice a year for 4 weeks, knowing that there's very few of us who can do it for 4 weeks, so sometimes you come for 2-3 weeks. But we love you to be part of it, because we do think that you learn something from incredible speakers who are mostly our parishioners, which is incredible. And secondly is in the small groups that will follow the discussion is that you will get to know people in those small groups. And there's so many friendships, and I know in talking to the speakers from last time, Jim and a few other guys, that they actually do continue coaching and meeting with some younger folks and helping to kind of figure out the way in different industries. So I think it's a tool for you. It's an opportunity for you to get to know people. It's an opportunity for you, if you're at that position, to spend time in coaching and helping others. And I think that's what the church is. It's about a community that makes our lives meaningful, because we all follow the teaching of Jesus. So thanks for being part of it. I'll start us off with prayer, and then Marco will introduce JP to that. God, we thank you for bringing us together this evening here at St. Clement. Thank you for every man in this room who, with no doubt, has a lot to share. Thank you for JP and first his many years of really presence here and active participation, and for his leadership that makes a tremendous difference in the city and the state. Thank you for people before us, for all the men and women throughout the last 120 years here at St. Clement, who actually brought so much value and help in helping others to shape their lives. Thank you for our families, those people that we love in our lives. Pray your blessing upon our Lenten journey. And we ask that today will be just a good moment of encounter with you through one another. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Hi, Marco Ropeza, who is one of our leaders, will do the intro.
Thank you so much.
What's with the hat?
Marco said to me, Daddy, you need a haircut. And so I figured I would do that since I'm standing up in front of people. Do you not like it?
No.
Whatever. It's Executive Speaker Series there. You get to see my ridiculous haircut. Is that better? All right, awesome. Well, it's great to see you all this evening. As Father Peter mentioned, my name is Marco Oropesa, and it really is my pleasure to welcome you this evening. It's been wonderful to see this series go from a group of 20 men about 2.5 to 3 years ago to what it is now. I think there's over 120, 130 people here. So thank you for being a part of it, and thank you for braving this. I heard the second winter of Chicago, right? And we got winter, then we got fake spring, and now we're in second winter. So hopefully you put your coat on, unlike I did. I was not prepared. So again, it's my pleasure to welcome JP Gallagher. And the great thing about JP is this is not his first time at St. Clement. He's actually spent a lot of time at St. Clement before him and his family moved away. And so it's great to be able to welcome him back here. It's a bit of a homecoming, so thank you, JP, for making the time to come and be with us and just share with us about your experience of some of the ups and downs of life. And JP has a very illustrious career in healthcare. He's a top healthcare executive, leads one of Illinois' largest healthcare systems. And so he'll be able to tell us a little bit about what it means to really have experience of blending life on a professional level, but on a personal level, and some of the challenges and fruits that kind of come with that. So we're excited to have him here. But I think the thing that I encourage you to really pay attention to is how it was that faith played a critical role in the story of JP, kind of maturing and growing over time. I think that the name of the topic is the True North Star, and that's really what JP is going to unpack for us, right? How is it that faith played a critical role at various junctures of his life? So again, it's my pleasure to welcome JP.
Thank you, Marco. So it is really great to be back for me, as Marco mentioned. So just a little bit of background. So my wife, Krista, and I met on a blind date in 1999, shortly after I moved to Chicago. Lived in the city for 15 years, and for all of those years, we were members of St. Clement Parish. So from a pretty early and formative part of my life, St. Clement was very much an anchor, which I guess kind of sticks with the symbol, but was really community. So it's actually pretty gratifying to see this gathering, which I don't recall there being something like this when we were active parishioners. But I do very much believe in the power of community and connection, so it's great to see that continuing. A lot of good memories from just this place. So spent a lot of time in this room. I think the decor is a little different, but a lot of like daddy-daughter dances and like Valentine's and other fun events. A lot of time across the street. We tended to end up in the chapel mass downstairs. I don't know if she's still a part of the choir, but there was this guitarist named Kirsten, who like my 7-year-old daughter was fascinated with. She might as well have been Taylor Swift. So we like had to sit within 2 rows, and Lauren just kind of kept her eyes on Kirsten. And again, it was really powerful to be connected and supported. And part of what I'll share in our family's journey was an experience that changed kind of our trajectory involving our daughter's health, and we were a part of this community. And actually, Father Kent was a big part of making that transition something we can manage. So I'll shed a little bit of light on that in a bit. It's also kind of fun to see how things evolve and change. And so I remember when we were parishioners here, every now and then there was this assistant pastor who would come, this Polish priest who was young and energetic, and he always finished every sermon off with a joke. And we're like, this guy's great. And then we ended up in Wilmette many years ago, and sure enough, Father Peter had been spending time in St. Francis, and then now back here. So it's great to see how good people find their way around. Also great to see a couple familiar faces. I happen to serve in the parish council here for a number of years with both Father Ken and Craig Knapp and Kelly Dorgan. So good to see you guys. So when Father Peter reached out, I think it was a couple months ago, he mentioned this series and invited me to talk. He described it as kind of young professionals who are interested in sort of advice from people who have had different experiences. I now, just looking around this room, realizing there's way more experience in this audience than I have to offer. So, and I will also, in full disclosure, much of what I'm going to share tonight is something that I give when I guest lecture at Kellogg. So my wife and I lecture about once a semester in the MBA program there. And much of what we talk about is juggling 2 careers, which is something that we did for a long time. But a lot of what I share is targeted towards an audience that has very little real-world experience, which I don't think is the case in this room. So my guess is I'm going to share some things and you guys will be like, yeah, that's pretty obvious, or yeah, I've already been there, done that. But that said, I'm glad to offer whatever might be useful. Again, I'll certainly share my story, maybe a few lessons learned along the way. What does make it interesting, if it is at all thought-provoking, is the Q&A and the engagement. So my goal is to be as open and honest as I can be. There are definitely lessons learned from failures along the way. But if there's anything that I can go deeper on or something that's not clear, don't hold back. Happy to do it. It's a lot more interesting that way. So with that, I will just give a little bit about kind of my story and how I got here, if I can figure this out. Sorry, is this
Here you go, you got it.
Yep, okay, good, I hit something right. All right, so as Father Peter was saying, I think like most of you, faith was a big part of my experience growing up. So in my case, I grew up in a pretty tight-knit family. I had 2 sisters, one older, one younger, active Irish Catholic family. Grew up primarily in Minnesota, Twin Cities area. We moved around a little bit because of my dad's job. But from as early as I can remember, between going to mass and sort of volunteering and just being involved in our parish, there was kind of just an underlying expectation that one, faith is important, kind of moral framework and values. But also when it came to sort of growing up in whatever path you would pursue, I never recall my parents saying, hey, this is a good career, or you should do this. But I do remember some sense of, whatever you do, make sure it has an impact and helps people beyond yourself, right? So there was sort of, I would say, some kind of general orientation towards service, although I didn't know what that would look like. So that was kind of the background. Grew up, ended up going out east for about 10 years. I think the only tangible professional decision I made in college was not to go straight to law school. I was a liberal arts major. It seemed like kind of a logical next step. Wanted to kind of take a pause. And I ended up spending a year in St. Louis in a program that rotated me through a variety of public sector organizations. So I thought I might go into kind of the public sector. Spend time in some city, state, and federal agencies. Frankly, none of them really kind of connected. But I had a couple of sort of coincidental experiences in healthcare. One was working for the city health department in St. Louis in the early 90s, which was, if any of you know St. Louis, much like Chicago, a very segregated city. So North St. Louis, underserved, lack of resources, a lot like the South and West sides here. And I spent the better part of 6 weeks kind of immersed in North St. Louis as they were trying to address a sort of a public health epidemic. I had no tangible skills to offer, but it was a great opportunity for me to sort of spend time with some of the federal and city health workers, talking to ministers, drug addicts, and prostitutes about safe sex and clean needles and kind of basic messaging across communities. So that was eye-opening. And then later in that year, I had a chance to sort of do some work for a local community hospital, part of a Catholic health system. And the benefit for me there was I just kind of was showing up to a hospital every day. And while I was doing that, I was meeting doctors and nurses, and these are people who were very much connected to their community, and working at an organization that was important to that community. So that kind of resonated. Again, as someone who I didn't grow up with any doctors or nurses in our family, I was not clinical. I didn't anticipate kind of going back to med school or anything like that. But I started to ask some questions of, I wonder if there's a way that someone like myself, more of a generalist, could find a path to contribute somewhere in kind of this healthcare space. So with that, I sort of packed up my bags and I moved to Washington, D.C., and I got a job with a healthcare consulting firm. Just a little bit of luck, a little bit of just gumption. And I spent the next 3 years as an analyst, basically doing work for clients that were mostly teaching hospitals or community hospital systems on the East Coast. And so for me, that was great exposure to, and this was in the early 90s, it's gonna sound archaic, but under the Clinton administration, healthcare reform was starting to get traction, so there's a lot of action kind of in the industry, and I thought, there might be something here. I'll show you a slide in a second, but the other thing that I also realized about myself is I always enjoyed being on teams. And so sort of seeing these organizations and teams who were trying to navigate tough issues, make big decisions, work with different stakeholders, it started to resonate, and I sort of said to myself, I wonder if I could somehow get into that setting directly and start to learn sort of how do you support a hospital, how do you work with doctors and nurses and sort of understand the mechanics of sort of hospital administration. So that was sort of the professional path. Over the same period of time, kind of coming back to the faith and the personal part, I had a series of experiences that I certainly didn't anticipate, but with the benefit of hindsight, were probably more formative than I realized at the time. So late in my college experience, I lost a college roommate to a plane crash. He was Air Force ROTC. My brother-in-law committed suicide, and then I had a good friend from college the year after, when we were both in DC, who was killed in a carjacking. And in each of these instances, these were people I was really close to. In 2 of the 3 instances, I had either been with or talked to the person the day before. And in each of the instances, like, did not see it coming, right? I mean, this was sort of shock, tragedy. I'm sure many people in this room have experienced real loss. But for me, at the age of 23, I had lost 3 very close people in my life, and sort of wrestling with the kind of why and what do you do with that? A lot of emotions, each of them has their own experience. They would be a different story in themselves. Found myself in the middle of several situations involving each of the families. So college roommate who passed away, his name was Morgan. 6 of my buddies all have kids named Morgan. His parents all came to our funeral or our weddings. So relationships have strengthened. But each of these experiences, I sort of found myself kind of knocked down, saying, okay, well, what do you do about this? The benefit for me of those experiences early on was how to think about what really mattered, right? So at the age of 24, I sort of said, wow, it's not clear how much time we have on this earth, right? Like, nothing's guaranteed. And for different reasons, right? These people that I cared about were no longer here. And so I started to kind of recalibrate what I thought was important in terms of the path I wanted to go down and sort of what I wanted to get out of whatever I applied myself to. So in this case, and this is where talking to Kellogg kids is sometimes helpful, money went way down on the list, right? So like, yes, need to have a career, I want to support a family, but doing work that had meaning and being in an environment where I believed in the values, where I felt like what we were doing mattered, like, jumped to the top of the list. And I was already probably oriented towards being in settings where some of that was there, but it became very real at a pretty early age for me. That was helpful because as I found myself in different settings, surrounded by people who were considering different paths. So in my case, I ended up in business school, and like from the day I set foot on campus, I was like, how do I get into nonprofit healthcare? Like, how do I find a path? And none of the organizations I was interested in were recruiting on campus, right? So a lot of friends that go off and do investment banking, consulting, and that sort of thing, and have very good friends in those fields. But I knew early on I was going to be looking at a path that was going to be different. I was paying my way through grad school, and also anticipating I wasn't going to, the income stream wasn't going to be the same coming out. So it was just a different framework and mindset. But I was really focused, and I had some very good mentors who said, go get good experience. Right? So if this is if your instincts are saying, hey, you want to be in an organization, go get frontline leadership experience, have people report to you, understand P&L, learn how to make decisions, learn how to fire people, learn how to do kind of the blocking and tackling of leading on a very small scale. And that was incredibly valuable advice. And so that's essentially what my orientation was. So I was in graduate school, reached out to a bunch of health systems. Half of them didn't respond, but a few did, and I ended up realizing that the path I was interested in required kind of going back to training. So I had to pursue the administrative fellowship, and that took me to Chicago, working for a health system named Advocate, which was big then, it's much bigger now. And I spent my fellowship at Christ Medical Center on the south side of Chicago, which is a really busy level 1 trauma center, and was a great first experience. So had a chance to just work with really good people, pretty intense place. It's even bigger now, but a great opportunity to just kind of cut my teeth and kind of learn the day-to-day of how to interact with folks and troubleshoot issues and really understand people. I think is probably the most fundamental part of that. So that's kind of what got me down that path. So that's a little bit about the healthcare. I'll talk more about my experiences lately. And then towards the end, and this was kind of the part that Nick mentioned might be relevant, is kind of things that have been helpful along the way. Again, my guess is many of you already know this or have your own version of them, but I'll share with you mine in case it's helpful. All right, so the first is kind of going back in time. There we go. Okay, So, all right, we're doubling down. Oh, this is going really fast. All right, so just speaking of like kind of how you're wired and what you enjoy. I'm really not good at this, am I? All right, it was okay, so this is the Breck freshman basketball team in 1985. And that's what a 4'10", 90-pound point guard looks like, which is yours truly. So, and again, the relevance of this is not, I was definitely not gifted. But I loved competitive sports and I loved being on teams, and I still do. And I would say that that has been relevant in terms of, dealing with people, dealing with pressure, discipline, but also dealing with failure and learning and growing and frankly, building teams. I spend a lot of time focusing on building teams. And those lessons start early, and I'm sure many of you in this room have had them at different levels, probably at a higher level than I did here. But it is funny to me, so we've been growing a lot, going through a lot of mergers. I have a new executive leadership team. We were together for 4 hours last Tuesday, and I did a case study on sort of the importance of discipline and structure, and I ended up talking about Nick Saban for 20 minutes. Our chairman of neurosurgery is good friends with him, so had some insights which are great. So I think that applies. All right, Nick, I'm not sure what I'm doing here. So before I fly away. So just now, I'm just going to quickly cover some of the work stuff. This just gives you a sense of scale, and again, it's not all that relevant. So our organization, we just are in the process of rebranding as Endeavor Health, but historically I was with North Shore University Health System, primarily anchored up in the northern suburbs, which is why we moved to Wilmette 8 years ago. And we have, through a series of combinations over the last 3 years, we're now 9 hospitals, 27,000 employees. We serve about 1.4 million patients. We'll do about $6 billion in revenue this year, and we're the 3rd largest health system in the state of Illinois. Healthcare is incredibly important. It is intensely personal. It is very people dependent, and it is complicated, heavily regulated, and very competitive. And a market like Chicago is there's lots of good healthcare providers. It's very fragmented. I'd say probably Chicago, New York, and LA have some parallels in that regard. Most of the other markets in the U.S. are not quite as intensely fragmented as Chicago is. But nevertheless, so we have been growing. With that comes change. We was very proud when Swedish Covenant Hospital joined North Shore. Let's see, it was January of 2020, just before the pandemic, which has been a great addition. Swedish is a really important, vibrant safety net hospital. We speak about 40 languages on the Swedish campus. They have a very proud and strong tradition of serving the underserved. We have a lot of immigrants who are now really dependent on Swedish in terms of just their general health and well-being. And so the complexion of our organization has changed tremendously. Much to the better, but with that means how do you bring together different cultures? How do you create alignment and frankly build teams, but prioritize and then start making strategic decisions? So that's the journey we've been on, and this is what we look like today. Thanks. Just a snapshot. I mean, you all know Chicago, so these blue dots are directional in terms of. So we have over 300 sites. Most of the care we provide is in outpatient settings. Obviously, the hospitals are very important anchors, both in our communities as well as where a lot of the most acute services are provided. And so that's just kind of what the footprint looks like. Next slide. And then, I think we're good at what we do. It's again, it's a competitive industry. One of the things that's gratifying is, as we talk about it, and this was actually part of the Nick Saban talk, was, I tell our team, don't focus on outcomes, right? Like, don't worry about the awards, don't worry about, now, I worry about clinical outcomes and consistency, because that's a sign of doing the right things and performing at a high level. And when you do those things, then this stuff follows. So when I'm talking to the grad students, it's just telling them, hey, if you're consistent and you do the right stuff, it can pay off. Thanks. Okay, so now I'm going to kind of get personal again. This actually does come right back to St. Clement. So October 12th of 2012, I was at work and my wife called me saying, well, we'd been talking the day before. Our oldest daughter was really thirsty and peeing a lot. And any of you who are clinicians in this room know that can be a sign of type 1 diabetes, which in our case it proved to be the case. So remember it like yesterday. She took her to the pediatrician's office. Said, yeah, you're probably overreacting. Don't worry about it. And then her blood sugars were sky high. They were north of 600. So we said, you guys need to go to Lord. So dropped what we were doing, and ended up. That picture on the left is from Lauren's room at Lurie, and our world changed overnight, right? So many of you, probably most of you, are dads. You understand that the worst feeling in the world is when you cannot protect your child, and that's what this was. Now, that said, as it happens, type 1 diabetes is an endocrinology-related disease, and it was kind of helpful when she was on that unit because it is co-located with brain tumors. And so every time I walked to a room, I'd walk past rooms with 6-year-old kids who were, going through, truly life-threatening procedures. So, as tough as this was for us, it's something that we can manage. We have been all in on this. And Lauren, that photo's from a couple years to the right. She just finished high school. She's a great young woman. Diabetes does not define her, but it is very much a reality for her, and it's been a huge reality for our family. The moment that the moment that I mentioned earlier that resonated was when we had the diagnosis and we spent 4 days in the hospital kind of learning how to, prick fingers, check blood sugar, understand foods, carbs, all that stuff, because it's a 24/7 condition. We were like, well, what does this mean for, how do we keep her safe? And Lauren at the time, I think was in 1st grade. And so we met in Melissa Dan's office, principal's office. There was a nurse here at St. Clement, and Father Ken showed up. For the next hour, everybody practiced how to read blood sugar. And we realized we're going to be okay. So this community was instrumental in our ability to kind of stay grounded and figure out kind of how do you move forward. So eternally grateful, but it was also obviously a big pivot for us personally as we thought about what does this path look like for us going forward. So just, if she were here, and my wife is the much better, more interesting part of this conversation, which is why the professor at Gallagher invites us, so my apologies because you're missing that. But Krista, before I met her, was in investment banking, worked in Berlin, fluent in German, went to business school at Kellogg, worked at McKinsey, and then was hired by Jamie Dimon into Bank One at the time, and then was at JP Morgan for 13 years. So she was very much kind of on a career path, and we were both going full bore and grateful for this community. Had a nanny who kind of often kept many of the plates spinning, and then Lauren's diagnosis happened, and it was like, okay, what do you do now? In our case, our nanny, who was a DePaul grad, wanted to get into teaching, so when she did, that kind of called the question. And so Krista at that point stepped back from work, which was a huge challenge and still frankly a big void and something that we're still sort of sorting through. But nevertheless, for us, it was a big pivot in terms of priorities, and then also had me asking questions about, okay, how does my job potentially impact the way that we are able to kind of support Lauren. So next slide. Okay, so now I'll talk a little bit about, this is kind of shifting back into the work mode. As I know you all have experienced, in the last now almost 4 years have been intense and tough, particularly in healthcare. So I'm just going to walk you through a few things. This will maybe get to a little bit of some of the lessons learned, and if it triggers any questions, happy to tackle them. All right, so most recently, in terms of high-profile crises, this is the mass shooting at Highland Park on July 4th of 2022. This shooting took place in downtown Highland Park, which is a mile from our Highland Park Hospital. The picture on the left is Cooper Roberts, who was a 9-year-old boy whose spinal cord was shattered by a direct hit from one of those bullets, and we saved his life. We saved a lot of lives that day. That's Dr. Talamani, our chairman of surgery, who ended up getting broadcast around the world. And on one level, this was an absolutely awful day. If you have several hours, I'm glad to talk to you about gun violence and my views on that, and what I think we collectively need to do and involved with some other healthcare leaders in terms of trying to think about some change in that space. But in the meantime, this was as bad a day as this was our team at its best. Now, part of it is we rehearse for things like this, as maybe dark as that sounds. And we implement things across our hospitals, particularly the North Shore hospitals that were sort of highly integrated for many years prior to this event. And that ends up mattering. But what you can't account for, and really what is the glue that allows days like this day to happen the way they did, is, so we have a whole call tree. Before the call tree went out, we had 40 nurses and anesthesiologists just show up at Highland Park, right? Like, that wasn't because we sent an APB out, it was because they saw what happened and they knew they might be needed. We stood up 9 ORs inside of 30 minutes. Now, unfortunately, not all of them were needed, because the fallout was so dramatic. The waiting room was washed in blood. It was just an awful, awful day. But it's also a reminder of why we do what we do, and the stakes that can be involved, and why being prepared matters. So that was certainly a memorable day. Next slide. Obviously the pandemic, which, the effects of which are still, very much, I think, playing through the healthcare system. But there were experiences there that, there was never any class in grad school that covered sort of this kind of experience. But this is where I will say, developing strong teams, recognizing what you don't know, and giving people the bandwidth to run and come up with creative solutions ended up being absolutely critical. So just to give you a little bit of flavor, so we turned Glenbrook Hospital into an all-COVID hospital in 10 days because we felt that concentrating patients in a singular setting, getting negative airflow in 140 rooms was going to be safer, more reliable, and we could concentrate our expertise and our resources. And it played out that way. I mean, again, this was really tough stuff. COVID as a general disease is not something that is reversible, especially when you have a lot of comorbidities. And so, we had a lot of tough outcomes, but our outcomes were also measurably better than both the state and national averages. That said, the photo in the top left, that's one of our nurses in the ICU at Glenbrook. Because we could not allow visitors, nurses were often the last connection between family members and a patient who was dying. So that nurse is holding up an iPad so that family members can say goodbye to a patient that's about to die. That happened every week for about a year. And so when you think about culture, and you think about an environment, and you think about how you show up, that's part of leadership, and that's part of understanding how do you do right by people who are showing up every day, like dealing with this reality, right? So a lot of it was rounding. So our team, were very intentionally visible. My biggest job was making sure the resources were available and we were listening and responding. So, I think it was probably March 25th, I got on a call with our board and I said, listen, I have no idea how much this is going to cost, but we have got to spend whatever it takes to keep our people safe, right? I mean, supplies were hard to account for. I think one of the bigger breakthroughs I had was I found some distributor in South Dakota for those hoods. Those are CRNAs. Those are the nurse anesthetists who frankly spent the lion's share of the time in a room saving patients, and we paid a pretty penny for them, but it was absolutely essential that we got 1,000 of them like right away. So those are the things that we learned together, and on some level, I think our culture shined. I think systems that are strong show their strength when they're under stress, and systems that are vulnerable break. And we weren't perfect, but I am very proud of a lot of what took place when we came together during all this. All right, next slide. All right, so I want to talk about two other pretty seminal moments, and again, not professing any answers, but this has certainly been a part of our journey as an organization and my journey as a leader. So the photo in May 20th, that's the front property of Evanston Hospital. That was, a few, probably days after George Floyd's killing. And like most organizations, that experience and kind of that social awakening was painful, but incredibly important in terms of our being open and honest about what we were or were not doing in terms of supporting our patients, our communities, but especially our team members. And so I'll share a little bit about what that felt like and sort of some of the things I learned. You know, more recently, obviously, the events in Gaza, which I don't profess to have any answer or suggestion that we handled it all that well, but when these events happen, they are very real and very present in organizations like ours. Now, I tend to think that whether you say something or take a position, I think frankly that is far less important than what actions you follow through with. But that said, there is in some spaces an expectation that leaders are somehow espousing values or articulating things that I think at times are not certainly not easy and perhaps not able to really fully capture the issues at hand. But I'll start with the first. So if you go to the next slide, in our case, it was very clear. As proud as I am of the organization, as much I like to think that our team and myself have done a lot of good things in terms of our values and supporting our team members. One of the most important things I think when you're in a position of turmoil is to listen. Right? It sounds very basic. Oftentimes your instinct is to try to solve or act. And in this case, it was very clear to me that I did not have a lot of answers. And there was a lot of anger, there was a lot of frustration, there was a lot of anxiety. But I realized we had to do something and we had to create a space where people could talk. So what you see here are a couple of sort of forums. These were telecast across the entire organization. I hosted a few of these. And so I was lucky in that I had, in all instances, several individuals of varying sort of leadership roles. So bottom left, that's Gabrielle Cummings. She now runs all 4 of our North Shore hospitals. At the time, she was president of Highland Park Hospital. And they were, I just kind of asked open-ended questions in terms of what the experience following George Floyd, not just felt like, but then sharing their own experiences. And it was shocking to me how much of a disconnect existed within our own organization, right? And one of the things I'd like to think I do is get out quite a bit and connect and talk and know. When I was president of Evanston Hospital, I knew all 2,500 people by name, but it was still alarming to me that so many people did not feel valued, heard, or respected in some shape or form. So what Gabrielle described is all of my team members we shadow by design, oftentimes put on scrubs and just spend time out on the units. And when Gabrielle does that and walks in the basement of the hospital, which is where a lot of our support services reside, doctors who she deals with on a daily basis did not recognize her, right? Just kind of a filter, and sort of, well, what does that say about how we sort of, recognize, connect, and are present? So there were any number of stories. So that was the starting point, right? Then we pulled together 40 individuals, diverse individuals from across the entire organization, and said, okay, help us figure out a path forward. Right? This was not administration or someone. Between my life experience and my own lens, it was pretty clear I wasn't going to have the answers. But we stood a team up and we said, okay, we'll get your resources, but sort of find a way that we can engage and start to talk. And that led to about 8 to 10 months of focus groups and then priorities. And what we ended up doing was really doubling down on what became a much more robust kind of DE&I, not program, but I would say approach to it. And then we took $200 million and set it aside in a community investment fund and said, okay, going forward in perpetuity, we're going to spend about $12 to $15 million a year on issues directly addressing our communities and sort of social determinants of health and other aspects that relate to the role we're playing in the organization in terms of looking at equity and a variety of other issues. So that's been in place now for 3 years. It is incredibly motivating and powerful to see. These are pretty sizable grants that we give to about 40 different organizations across the entire Chicago metro area. Domestic violence, homelessness, food insecurity, immigration. It's a wide range of needs. There's no shortage of it, but I mean, this is grassroots impact, and it's often us partnering with organizations who know these clients and know these issues far better than we do. So it's a different dimension of what we do as an organization, which has been really compelling. Okay, so this just speaks to to me, leadership is a privilege. It's a tremendous responsibility. This is a job that is personal, right or wrong. but it is also one where relationships, I think, are just essential, and it's also the most gratifying part of the job. So, next slide. Oh, this is probably less relevant. This is when we talk to the Kellogg kids. Krista gets up and kind of gives her talk, but again, you know, life happens, right? So our son Liam was born with a congenital ear defect. He had 5 surgeries between the ages of 8 and 10 to try to not lose his hearing. Picture on the right is Krista's mom, who died of cancer about 4 years ago. My dad died unexpectedly of a brain aneurysm. And so these are, to me, the lesson here, and actually this probably is relevant to this audience, is just how important having a strong partner is, right? Whether it's marriage or otherwise. You know, coming out of grad school, highly motivated, wanted to go, you know, change the world, and then life catches up with you, and you realize your ability to do any of that is only as good as the relationship with your partner is, because this is going to happen. And how do you get through that, right? And again, we've had our bumps in the road, and it's not easy, but I've been incredibly lucky and blessed, and we are definitely stronger today than you know, we were 22 years ago. And it's also the most gratifying part of it. Okay, next one. All right, so this was kind of the reflective part. Some of this may be pretty self-evident, but I would say, you know, when I think about my professional journey, you know, faith in a moral compass has always been there, right? I mean, you in this room, you had to make tough calls. You find yourself in difficult situations. You don't always get it right, but I do believe sort of focusing on trying to do the right thing generally is hard to stray too far from in terms of getting it wrong. And then, you know, coming back to and reflecting on, okay, what did I miss, right? So for me, habit, every day, or I should say every night, take out an index card, write down 6 things that I want to tackle the next day. So I kind of look at the calendar. It's not so much, you know, complete X, Y, or Z. It's oftentimes if I have a high stakes meeting or an issue where I want to make sure that I leave an audience with a certain takeaway, that I'm mindful about that. And then I take that card at the end of the day, flip it over, and I write down something I could have improved upon and something that I'm grateful for. Again, it's just a little habit, but it's something that has allowed me to sort of make sure that I'm pausing and reflecting, and it has also at times helped me to sort of make sure I get through stuff in the day. So for me, another key thing is just staying active. So I've always enjoyed that, but it's probably as much stress relief. So pretty physically active. It's changed over the years. Now I got, you know, hip arthritis and aches and pains and the kind of stuff that catches up with you. But Matt Anderson, I'm going to be playing paddle tennis tomorrow at like 10 o'clock at night, right? So it's out in Glen Ellen. It's going to be glorious. But I love competing. I love still, you know, getting out there, and you know, now the guys are a lot younger than I am, but it is still part of my identity and part of what keeps me energized. Stay curious. I mean, this one I guess this comes naturally to most everybody in this room, but just keep learning, right? You know, I think, and it's not necessarily always about work stuff, right? I think just people who are naturally curious, who are looking for answers, are I think. More interesting and bring more to the table, and I also talk about this with my teams in terms of how you engage others, right? So when we brought North Shore and Edward Elmhurst together, it was a big merger and there's a lot of anxiety. I don't know if you guys we're big fans of the show Ted Lasso, and so I played the video of the dart scene where he basically dupes the jerk of a guy by basically, you know, saying, hey, you made a bunch of assumptions about me. Be curious, and I think that's very true. And so, you know, as I was getting our teams ready to sort of engage and start to integrate, I'm like, start with listening and being curious, and I think that definitely applies. Healthy relationships, that's the you know, the partner, the spouse thing, which is a two-way street, right? So professionally, Krista made tremendous sacrifices for my benefit, and I am like grateful on a daily basis for, you know, without guilt or some sense of resentment. But it is, you know, I've got to be carrying my side of that equation, and making sure that, you know, she feels like she has, you know, her identity and her opportunities to engage the way she wants to, and then balance and perspective, right? I mean, the older I get, the more I recognize how many answers I don't have, and it is pretty humbling, especially when you see people who do the kinds of things that I get a chance to see, and so just keeping that in perspective and recognizing that, you know, you have a role to play, but oftentimes that role is a quiet one in the background and in a supportive role. Okay, next slide. The other thing I just simply say, again, some is probably just redundant, but if I were talking to my 27-year-old self, I would say invest more in relationships. Certainly with your spouse, absolutely with your kids, but also in peers and friends, right? Because as careers evolve and grow, and there are setbacks, right? So those roommates that I was with, there were 8 of us when Morgan died. There's been several divorces, there have been kids in crisis, but you can't reestablish those friendships. So taking the time to respect and spend time in those relationships, because they do stay with you for a lifetime, is important. Focus on what you can control. Again, pretty basic stuff, but it is easy to get your mind wrapped around the axle of lots of moving parts, lots of issues. When you're in leadership roles, problems tend to sort of make their way to you, and I find it's helpful to kind of try to boil down to what can you affect, and what frankly is just going to have to sort of be left aside or saved for another day. And then I do think the attitude you bring to things matters a ton. So I'm a fan of something called the Daily Stoic. It's sometimes it's a little trite, but basically the principle is you can't control what's happening around the world. The only thing you can control is how you respond, and I think that is very true. And I tell myself, there's one of the signs in my office is "This too shall pass." So when things are going really well, remember it's going to change, and when things are going, and we're dealing with some really tough stuff right now, it's in the newspaper, this too shall pass. So it's a bit of an anchor and a guidance, and again, if we're working off of our values, I can sleep well at night. And then cultivate hobbies. Like, you have to have outlets, right? So whether it's coming to gatherings like today, one of the things I've come to appreciate is embrace stuff you're not good at, right? So I tell my kids, one of my biggest regrets is I didn't study Spanish. I studied French because I thought the Tour de France was a cool race, which has been really relevant. But I could use Spanish every day on the job, and so I am trying to learn Spanish now, and my daughter loves to laugh at how bad I am, right? And that's okay, right? Like, someday I hope to be able to have a proficient conversation. But it is part of, I think, just, recognizing that on some level we're all beginners. So, and then, enjoy the ride, right? I mean, we work too hard, time goes really quick, things can happen unexpectedly. So enjoy what you've got. I think you had asked for some questions, so those are some. So that's kind of my take on things. I'm glad to take any questions. All right, 3 minutes for questions. Yeah.
When you don't know what you don't know, particularly when you were younger, how do you approach that? How do you tackle that?
Yeah. So when you don't know what you don't know, right? Like a Donald Rumsfeld reference, right? If you even know who he is. So I think it's a really important principle. One, I think asking good questions is really key, and then trying to surround yourself with people who you're confident bring knowledge or skills to the table that you don't, right? And then creating an environment where exchanging those ideas can happen openly and safely. In my case, it's easy in the sense that as a non-clinician who's got responsibilities for a lot of what happens in clinical settings, I don't know much of anything that can directly affect what happens with a patient. But creating an environment that attracts good physicians, or being able to invest in the caliber of people that are needed to do those things. So a lot of people on my executive team know way more than I do, and so it comes down to asking, I think, the right questions, and then I will often play things back and say, okay, this is what I'm hearing. And then ultimately, if you're in the leadership roles, sometimes you got to make a call, or you have to draw the line and say, like, we could hash this out for another 2 hours, but you got to also be comfortable dealing with imperfect information or ambiguity. So I'd say it has a lot to do with who you surround yourself with, and being curious. Yeah. Kelly.
Can you talk about how you are able to use your Christian Catholic values in decision making, more than just I do this because I believe it's the right thing for my faith, but can you kind of talk about, from a leadership perspective, how you use Christian values in an outward way? And then the second part to that question is anybody ever said to you at all in your career, like reflected on the decisions you made and said, I can tell you're a man of belief, based on the decisions and the way that you approach your leadership?
Yeah, so really good questions, Kelly. So the first is, I would say, yes, there are ways that I think I both consciously and probably subconsciously draw upon those values. That said, our organization is non-denominational, right? So if I worked for a Catholic health system, there'd be certain things that shaped, what we do as an organization that are not present. So that said, I think many of these values are universal, right? And I frankly don't think the values in many instances are limited to Christianity. But I do think sort of the fundamental belief and honoring of human dignity is critical, both in how you show up and treat people, and how you, particularly when others are struggling, how you are there. I mean, that sounds really basic, but I was talking to some grad students a while back. Like, you show up at the funerals, right? Like when one of my leaders, her daughter got diagnosed with she's in med school at Harvard, and got diagnosed with pulmonary embolism, which is like life-threatening, right? So she has to go be a mom for a week, right? Like, how do you be there and help people in times of crisis? To me, it's more sort of fundamentally how you engage others. So, when I'm in the halls, and I knew Evanston Hospital pretty well, stopping people in the hall, knowing what's going on with their family, remembering if something tough was coming up, and circling back. That has always been kind of part of my wiring, but also probably part of what's allowed me to connect effectively with others. Sorry, second part of your question was?
I was just asking, has anybody ever, like,
how
can we kind of
Sure.
recognize your
Yeah.
decisions and your faith?
Yeah, so yes, and I would say as I've gotten older, I've probably been more comfortable with being more explicit about it, right? So, if any team member emails me, I respond, right? And sometimes people will reach out to me. I like to think that people feel that I'm approachable. I tend to try to go many layers down into the organization. People will reach out with very personal stuff, and I'll say, you're in my prayers, right? And I don't apologize, don't shy away from that. Also think we're creating a pretty inclusive environment, irrespective of religious orientation. And I think there are some decisions, frankly, that we made as an organization, and when we established our values as an organization, I think the way I talked about it made it pretty clear that that was a very strong anchor for me. I don't think anyone has ever sort of felt like I was explicitly, or oppressively, evangelical in a sense. But I would say I certainly tried not to be opportunistic about it, but I don't think it had. I think it has helped in terms of my ability to connect with people, and it's definitely helped me in terms of navigating difficult situations. All right.
You want to take one more?
Oh, sure.
Just very quick.
So if I understand it, Endeavor is a not-for-profit
We are.
organization. How do you think your life pressures people you have to answer to? If you were for-profit, even worse, publicly traded for-profit, how would your life be different?
I mean, there are definitely things as an organization we would have to do differently, right? So I'm lucky in that. I mean, I have a board of directors who is incredibly talented, many of whom are on publicly traded boards and are, in some cases, former Fortune 500 CEOs. But I think the mission of the organization is paramount, and these are all people who are from our community, so we can make decisions with longer time frames, right? So there's not a quarter-to-quarter basis. Dividends are not something we worry. The dividend we worry about is investing back in our people. So we invested $163 million last year into our people, in terms of retirement accounts or merit adjustments, that kind of thing. We can invest in programs that that are not profitable because that's part of our mission. There are for-profit healthcare providers that do well, but also don't get into some of the spaces that we do. I'm proud to be part of an organization that leans into that.
Do you think your enjoyment of the job would be qualitatively different if you were for-profit?
Yeah, probably. I mean, I know people in that space, and some of them are very talented, and I respect them. But I was pretty intentional coming out of grad school and only looked at jobs in the nonprofit sector, it has been fulfilling.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.